the why of your business. That question runs through the whole thing around the patient experience. So why are you there? Why are your staff there? Why are you talking to the patient about something? Why are you prescribing it for them? Why should they take it from you and not from somebody else? That means that at every touch point, everything that you want to integrate into the practice, you ask the question, why? Why am I doing this?
Welcome to The Focused View, the podcast for eye care professionals across Australia. In each episode, we bring together leaders from optometry, optical dispensing, and business to share insights, practical strategies, and the latest developments shaping independent practice today. I'm your host, Michael Nasser, and together we'll explore how innovation, collaboration, and smart business thinking can drive growth, enhance patient care, and strengthen the future of independent optometry. Whether you're a student, an early career professional, or an established practice owner, The Focused View is your go-to source for knowledge, inspiration, and connection. The Focused View is brought to you by Vision Connection, supporting independent eye care professionals across Australia through collaboration, education, and business growth. By working closely with leading suppliers and industry partners, Vision Connection offers unique opportunities that help independents stand out and succeed. To find out more, visit their website, visionconnection.com.au.
Tim, thank you for joining us again.
Nice to be here, Michael. Nice to see you again.
Yeah, I'm really excited to chat about today's topic. We're really going to sort of do a deep dive with regards to practice flow, training, and I guess the future of, independent optometry and how you see it based on, what you've seen happen and what you potentially see happening in the future. So perhaps a little bit of crystal balling there. But I guess to get things going, when you look at the independent sector today, what are some of the biggest challenges and some of the biggest opportunities that you see?
Right. That's a very broad, very big question. I think one thing that is of interest to me is where are people making their revenue is something that's a challenge for them, because that's shifted fairly dramatically over the years. And there's so many aspects to practice these days that I think they probably, maybe they're not necessarily looking at exactly where each of their revenue streams are coming from. So that's one challenge, I think, for them, is to really deep dive into that. And I think the other one that I've noticed is trying to integrate this all new medical knowledge or disease treatment, therapeutics, and now they're looking at oral medications as well, making sure that that sits with traditional practice as well, which is also medically based. And I think there's a bit of a gap in some people's thinking between, all this medical knowledge, treatment, therapeutics, etc., and the traditional base. But there is so much medical knowledge in the traditional base as well that, and we'll probably talk about this a little bit later on, integrating those two things together as a full scope practice, if you like. I think the other thing too is knowing where to go if you want to be an independent practitioner. And there's probably some cultural challenges in that, which I think we're going to talk about as well. But you've got this whole thing where people often say, oh, but I'm competing with Specsavers, or I'm competing with OPSM, or I'm competing with HCF. Well, no, you're not. That's not who your competitors are. They have different business models to an independent practice. And so really understanding what that niche, or not even niche, what the positioning of your practice is really important too, because, the whole structure of these larger groups is completely different to an independent practice, and the way that they will establish themselves and so on. It's a very, very different animal.
Yeah, and I guess, you had touched on there the demographics and the industry, I guess, perception amongst itself with regards to therapeutics being a really big part of, of optometry practice today. And there was a period of time, where I guess therapeutics wasn't part of the course, but there was still, like you say, there has always been a medical component to it, obviously. And if you touch on it, I mean, one of the conversations I'll have quite often with people is the difference between the retail nature of our business and then the clinical side of the business. And I know we'll deep a little bit further, but how have you seen that evolve in your time? I mean, initially when you started, I would imagine that, shop fronts had to have curtains and there were restrictions because it was all medically based. And then it's probably developed into, gearing towards retail in between that period of time. Different business organizations, business models have come through and, been maybe more retail focused. But how do you speak to that for an optometrist that's sort of coming into it all and, trying to ascertain the lay of the land when it comes to what is the optometry profession? It's a little bit of a sidestep, but I just thought it's an interesting point because I do have that conversation quite often with sort of more younger optoms as well.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, but I'm probably going to be a little bit controversial here. I've always seen it as you are in a professional sales role. And that goes for doctors and specialist surgeons. They are selling a service, and they're selling different degrees of a service sometimes. So you imagine a cataract surgeon, he can do all sorts of different things. He might have a femtosecond laser versus someone who doesn't, etc. I mean, I think femtosecond's gone the way of the dinosaurs, but they are still selling a service, and they have to put that forward to the patient and say, I'm going to do this for you, and it's going to cost you X, Y, Z, particularly in the refractive surgery side of things. And you can get into dental and look at it. Dental, you can have a crown that costs you $200, or you can have a crown that costs you $5,000. And so there's all of the retail side of optometry is the same thing. You can have all these different aspects to your optical care or your ocular care, and you might not be able to afford all of them. And that will include everything from you need dry eye treatment, or you need a drop for some inflammation that you've got, or you need to go to a specialist, or you need to go and have your blood sugar taken, right through to, you need 3 or 4 pairs of specs to cover everything that you need to do in your life. And so the sales aspect, it's professional selling, it's professional retail, from your optometric services right through to an appliance, to a pair of contact lenses, to a drop. All of those things are retail. And so to me, there's no difference between selling someone a drop or selling someone a pair of specs. It's something that they need and that you're convinced that they need it. And so what you're giving them is a treatment, and it's no different to going to a doctor, a dentist, or any other health professional.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to raise, because I feel like there is this connotation of sales being a dirty word, for lack of a better term, but it's almost like it's more of a solutions based mentality, and I think that's a mindset approach, and I feel like the more that the industry harnesses that type of approach, well, then you're not really necessarily selling. You're helping your patient or your customers find a solution that meets their particular needs, and I totally can resonate with that, and I like that way of thinking as well, because it allows you to then contextualize all the services that you're offering and how to perhaps improve it too. So there is the element when you think like that of improvement, all in the name of being in business, which is obviously a big part of independent practice.
Yeah.
Something I wanted to touch on was, and something that you've probably seen over the years in your experience from when you started to sort of to now, is the shift in demographics of the profession. I guess new graduates, you've seen it over the decades with regards to the diversity that's now in the industry. What's your take on that? And I guess how have you seen that particular aspect of the industry change the way, if any, if at all, the way independent practices operate today? And if you can speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, when I went through optometry, it was very white, very male, and that was the norm. It was about 75% Anglo-Saxon blokes. And if you look at it today, you now have everything from the people from the subcontinent, you have people from the Middle East, you have Australian-born, people from Asiatic backgrounds. So you've got such diversity across, but you've also had this shift to being much more a female profession than a male profession. And that's happened, I really don't know how gradually that happened, But when I look at the numbers, and I'm probably wrong, but I'm just thinking about when I used to speak to the final year students, and you go, right, okay, there are so many girls in there now, and that's probably a reflection on the marks that are required, because I might not get into optometry today. I'm not too sure that I'd be able to get the 99.2 or 98.9 or whatever it is to get into the profession these days. So just to get into the course, you need people who are studious, who are smart, who can also have, I think at most universities, there's an interview component to getting into the course these days as well. So they have to be able to display some sort of patient empathy and how they'd be in that sort of chairside, bedside manner type thing as well, rather than just being a pure academic and there was a little while there where there were people who weren't doing so well in their final clinical year because they were focused on, I'm just going to be an academic. I don't want to be worried too much about seeing patients. And so that's where Uni of New South Wales, I believe, really changed their selection criteria so that they didn't have just the pure academic focus of some of these brilliant students that they were getting into the course. So I think in terms of independent practice, there are probably some cultural things, in certain cultures, the family likes to stay close together. And whether it be boys or girls or whatever, whoever, they like to be close to family. So they don't want to move too far away when they go into practice. You have also the thinking of, I'm not going to buy someone else's practice because I'd rather set up a business because that's what the family's always done as well. And so there are cultural changes like that which have probably meant that there's been a little bit more heaviness in people wanting to work in suburban practices rather than regional and rural, which in reality, some of the most successful practices in Australia and, money-wise, patient-wise, the whole shebang have been in rural and regional practices, and I think we were talking about opportunities before. I think that's one of the big opportunities is for people to move into those areas and continue the care that's being given in those areas as well.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to, say, the operation of stores, with that changing demographic, did you see a shift in the mentality? I mean, I guess that's also a broader question because society changed quite dramatically over the decades as well. But if we focus in on optometry specifically, did you see much of a shift with regards to how the practices themselves operated and how successful practices operated? Or has it always been the same? The fundamentals have always stayed the same.
Oh, I think the fundamentals have shifted a bit in terms of what people have now determined they need to know about the business. So when I was in practice, when I was in a partnership in South Australia, we were looking at some numbers and so on, but we were just looking at numbers of patients. And in the area I was, there was 170,000 people in my draw area, and there was 3 or 4 optometrists. And so you divide those numbers into 3 or 4 optometrists, you've got a big pool of people. Whereas today, I think your average optometrist has a pool of 8 to 10,000, something like that. So the number of people, the pool of people you can draw on means that if you're not appealing to that particular demographic, if you are not priced right, all those sort of things, it changes the way that you're going to approach your business. I think also that in terms of careers, has to be more flexible these days. If you are a more female-based profession, you have to be flexible because of the people you're going to be employing. You need to make sure they can come and go from the profession, that they have access to all the things they need as part of their career, but part of their life outside of working as well. So that's something which I think everybody has to be well aware of and to integrate into the way they approach business as well. And I've seen some practices do that really successfully and, gradually move people into their business, again, probably rural and regional, but even in local and suburban, where they've gradually moved someone in by looking at how they will practice and how they'll practice differently to the principle of the business as well.
I guess, and when we're speaking about the business itself and how it is run and operated, have you seen any particular shifts with regards to the ownership trends that you've seen? I guess it just probably coincides with changing demographic. And does that, when it comes to ownership specifically, have you seen, different types of groups, entities, structures? I mean, how has that evolved as well over the period of time that you've sort of been involved in the industry?
I've got a couple of examples where you've got people who really commit to an independent practice. And again, these are people I knew when they were students and then came out, and one went regional, one went suburban. And, they started out, they worked with somebody, and then they took the jump and opened their own practice. And the other trend that I've seen is that you've got optometrists who have a partner who is probably more business-minded than the optometrist. And the business-minded partner says, well, we're going to do this. And the optometrist says, yeah, sure, you do that. I'll just see patients. And two in particular where they weren't going to ever just have one practice. They've had three or, very quick succession, they opened 3 or 4. And so that's quite interesting to see how quickly people are setting up a group or a little chain or a little multiple practice compared to in my day where, you'd sort of go, well, I've got a couple of partners and we've got a few practices. Do we need more? Can we cope with more? All those things about when you've got one practice, it's fine. 2, you're probably doing it part-time. Once you get into 3, 4, 5, then you need a business manager, then you need a HR person, and all these sort of things start to multiply. So being aware and knowing all that side of the business, working on the business as opposed to in the business is a typical cliche, but I think that's really something that's essential. And the other thing which I think is, I'm not sure if this is something that's happening, I've seen it with the things like Provision, iCare Plus and various other entities as well, where there's much more an emphasis on the ratios. What are the finance ratios of the business? How much of your turnover is going in rent? How much is going in the salaries and all
as
your
a percentage?
As a percentage, yeah. What's your percentage of sales of this? What's your stock turnover? What's your stock carry? All that sort of stuff, which, in my day, we did things relatively simply, but we had an accountant as one of the partners and he was doing the big numbers. But even still, we looked at what was our average frame price? What was our mode? Where did we sell most frames? What was our sizing ratios? Were we selling, did we need big frames? Did we need kids' frames? Did we need ladies, men's? Breaking down your numbers, and with computers these days, it's a hell of a lot easier. So, you get your data. So knowing your data, and I think the other thing too is knowing where your patients are coming from, because you've got a hell of a lot of people who are leaving the industry and they've got an old patient setup. Now, what was their ratio of new patients to old patients? Can you change that? Can you attract new people? What's your marketing strategy? And it all gets back to this thing of how are you going to position yourself in the market? What are you wanting to do as a practice?
Yeah, the other interesting point in that is, especially if you're buying or acquiring this existing business and, there is a legacy there, is the demographic around the store the same as what it was when the store started 20, 30, 40 years ago? Because in lots of areas, there has been an evolution. And are you still connecting to that new demographic that's within your area that perhaps, wasn't there before? So that makes total sense. And I guess, from this, to wrap this particular part up, the industry and optics and optometry, there is a platform there for individuals to be entrepreneurial, to start a business, to be in control of what they want. Obviously, there are different forms of employment types and structures in the industry. But speaking about independence specifically, it does provide a vehicle for potential students or for people that are practicing that want to get into ownership at that path. And there is a lifestyle component in there, like we mentioned with women. Generally there's going to be family along the way, and so that's something that really is it runs through the industry in a very dominant way. And the industry is does very well to cater for that. And it doesn't see it as a limitation at all. It actually is opportunistic in that regard and is quite positive. But I think because we have the ability to create this environment, we can be super, strategic about it. It leads then into, well, how do we be strategic? And I think one of the areas that I want to pick your brain on is your experience with, with what you've done in regards to patient flow, patient experience. And I guess if we sort of deep dive this as a particular concept, if you were to start a practice tomorrow, what non-negotiables would you build into your flow and into your structure for that patient experience to begin with?
That's a really good question. And I'll come back to something that you were saying before in a minute, but I thought about this, and this is something that I've spoken on a lot. I would want everyone to know why they are there. So there's a guy called Simon Sinek who talks about the why of your business. What gets you out of bed in the morning? Why are you walking into your practice day in, day out? And that question runs through the whole thing around the patient experience. So why are you there? Why are your staff there? Why are you talking to the patient about something? Why are you prescribing it for them? Why should they take it from you and not from somebody else? So why is really, really important. And that means that at every point, every touch point, every thing that you do, everything that you think about, every conference you go to, everything that you want to integrate into the practice, you ask the question, why? Why am I doing this? And, then you can determine, all right, if you get the answer, I'm just doing this for revenue. Well, is that okay? Is that because you need that revenue, so only doing it for revenue? Or is there some other deeper motivation that is also going to be part of that and generate revenue? Or is it coming from an altruistic thing? I'm going to put in this range of frames for people who, I know are on pensions or on healthcare cards, and they're not necessarily going to be able to afford my average range of frames or something like that. So you're always going to be questioning, why am I doing this? What's the motivation? And how is that going to affect how I integrate this into my business? And that why then, it's like you go from the macrocosm of it down to the microcosm of it. And so when you're asking a question of a patient, why are you asking that question? What's it going to lead to in terms of having the patient think about an aspect of their vision care that they might not have, and how you're going to answer to that need because you've asked them why. And so it becomes an all-pervasive thing, and everyone from the receptionist through to the optometrists themselves, through to the dispensers, right through to the patient, need to know why they are being treated, prescribed, referred, asked to do something in the business, so all the time. And I think this has been something central that I've spoken about for a long time. And I think when I've spoken to practices about it and they get it, they've done really, really well by looking at that and integrating it across their business.
What are some of the, I know why is obviously going to be a very personal question, but in your observations, with the practice that you've dealt with, what are some of the strongest whys that you've seen that have really then translated in to a successful practice or operation?
Okay, so we talked about technology previously. Let's talk about integrating dispensing technology into a practice. So they looked at, why would they buy one of these machines, one of these towers for measuring? And their answer was, they believed that they were going to give their patient the best type of lens. They were going to be able to personalise it for them and be able to then have that as their benchmark and be able to work different pricing strategies for different levels. If people said, "Oh, look, I really don't want to spend that much on a pair of specs," then it looked at how they could structure their offering below that as well. But integrating a machine like VisiOffice or the Rodenstock Tower or all the other different versions of it out there is something which is quite costly. But
Mm.
if you look at it in the scheme of things, the overall cost compared to what you'll generate,
The
the
return.
return is minimal, and it's a tax deduction. You can write it off after. It's a depreciating thing in your
I see.
practice,
Mm.
and so when people were really thoughtful about that, and built it into the practice properly, built it into their flow properly, all of a sudden it changed the nature of how they were working with their clients,
Mm.
and their patients responded,
Mm.
their revenues grew, and they went, wow, this is really working very, very well. Have happy patients. They're sending people in to see me because I've got this, and the guy, other people don't.
Yeah.
And that's a very simple example, but one that has been very common in the last probably 10 years or so as these things have taken off.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier that, your competitors are not necessarily really your competitors because they run different business models within the industry.
Yeah.
And there are often, I've got a couple of examples of stores, independents that have actually partnered with the Specsavers, funnily enough, because they have a different why, I guess, if you were to bring that back into the equation, and their why is separate, and they've been able to identify their why, and they've gone in and created an opportunity where if you have a patient that doesn't fit your why, come in, they fit our way, send them our way, and they're quite happy to do so because they can't give them that particular service that they want anyway, and vice versa. The person going to the Specsaver store, in this example, is looking for something a little bit different to the person that's going into the boutique clinical independent store, and they actually have a very good working relationship amongst the two, which you wouldn't think at first instance, but once you peel back the onion a little bit, you're like, well, you've been strategic there, and you've created a mutually beneficial relationship, and it works for both of them. So,
It's
some interesting ways that I've seen, and a bit, is that especially, say, if we're focusing on the dispensing side of the industry, is dispensers that are really passionate about styling and colors and face shapes, and so they've got this drive to want to make people feel better. Like they want, they want the frame to sit on the face and just transform them and make them feel, more confident and the like. And so I always feel like that's been one that's I've seen. So, and this more dispenser focused. But with optometrists, what's interesting, because I always ask optometrists when I speak to them, so what got you into the industry? And invariably it's they have the condition, or they had the condition when they were younger, or they went to the optometrist, or their mum had it, or their dad had it. And that's ultimately their why. It's like, I'm doing it because I wanted to help myself and I wanted to help my family. And doing so, I've saw, oh, maybe this is the path for me. So I don't know if you came across that a lot, or if you come across that a lot where it's like, oh, well, I was inspired to be in the industry because of my first experience was me at an optometrist practice going, oh, wow, and I can do this.
I'm guilty as charged. I was a kid with bad eyes. I was +4 or +5 when I was 4 years old. So the big thick glass lenses in those days. And when I got through school and so on, I thought, gee, I've got crappy eyes. And I was reading about optometry and reading about the profession. Plus, I lived down the road from Professor Brian Leyland. His daughter's an optometrist as well. So I said, I'll go and knock on his door. And so he was very passionate about it. He's one of the people who got optometry into Medicare.
Yeah.
And so I changed my preferences. I put optometry as my number one preference and got in. And so, it is very
that simple.
Yeah, it can be that simple. And there's, a lot, and I've got one wonky eye, and I've got, these days I've got much cooler specs, and I had clear lens extraction done. So, my script is 1/10 of what it was, and all that sort of stuff. But, it's always been about, I've really loved it as lenses and things and treatments have improved over the years, because I've had the benefit of it as well. But it was interesting what you were saying about Specsavers, because one of the things that I've experienced talking with independents, particularly when Specsavers hit the market, God, it must be 15 years ago now.
Yeah, 2010.
2010-ish. And I'd walk into a practice and they'd say, I had to send 5 people away today because they came in looking for the Specsavers offer. And I went, you sent them away? And, well, I told them we don't do it. I said, well, the question you have to ask yourself is, if they wanted the Specsavers deal, they would be in Specsavers. So what's different about your
That's
practice
such a good point.
that person is standing in front of you and not standing in the Specsavers? So they're looking not for the deal, they're looking for something else from you. And this is why I say they're not competitors, because you see this all the time. You'll get people who say, oh, look, I've seen a frame somewhere else. But if, as a practitioner, you've sold them on your vision care for them, and this is the lenses you need, and these are the drops you need, and all this, you should be able to say, yeah, go and get your frame and come back here, and we'll fix the glasses up for you. And oftentimes they will. You know, people might get talked into it in another place, but then they have to do a whole new eye test and all the rest of it. But it's that whole thing of being confident enough that you have communicated to the patient what you can do for them, and that they are convinced of that you can say, well, okay, you don't like my frames, go and get the frame you want, come back to me, because we've had this chat and we know what you need, and I'm happy to look after you. So being able to be that free with thinking, the early days would have been, I can't do that, they're going to go off somewhere else and I'll never see that patient again. So these days I think there's a lot less fear around that if you are communicating to the patient the right way.
Yeah. Many see clinical, and optical dispensing as separate. I guess there is obviously a natural connection because, it leads into one another. But I think when we're looking at them, we tend to isolate them and speak about them individually, and then they just happen to, clash at some particular point. We've spoken in the past about integration. Why is that holistic approach so important in your opinion? And I guess going further, how can we further ensure that is maintained and developed in a strategic manner?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I've thought and written and spoke about this a lot. Integrated care is important because I think we talked about this last time. There's quite a churn in the optical industry. So about 25% of patients are willing to go somewhere else the next time, and that is probably because they don't feel like the care is being personalised enough or integrated enough, or they weren't told enough. One of the things that came out in attitude and usage surveys over the years with the US, with Europe and with Australia as well, was that people weren't told about anything that was new. They weren't told about something that could potentially solve a problem for them.
Right.
75% of the time, if they're told about it, they would take it. But only would you believe 1/3 of the time were they ever offered something new when they went to the practice, right? Wow. So there's this between what people think. Yeah, and a very simple one is that a lot of practitioners would put price as the number one reason people come into a practice. Price is about number 5 or number 7 down the list. What's the number one reason they walk into a practice? They've got something wrong with their eyes, right? What's the number 2 reason they walk into a practice? You're around the corner from where they live. Yeah. Oh, sorry. That's number 3. Number 2 is they want a recommendation on what to do about what's going wrong with their eyes. Number 3 is you're around the corner from where they live. So all of a sudden, I've got something wrong with my eyes. I need a recommendation from an optometrist. I'm going to walk into that practice around the corner from where I live. And then you start to get into other things below that. So integrated care is taking that whole thought process around they've got something wrong with their eyes, and even in spite of all our great efforts over the last 40 years, the public just tend to remain a little bit unaware of vision and vision care and so on. They have Dr. Google, so they come in thinking they've got cancer or something, but most of them are just looking for a recommendation because they haven't got the knowledge. And so once you have that puts you number one in a position of power, but in a position of responsibility as well. So being able to take the patient from what they think they want, which probably half of the time they're going to want, I just want reading glasses because that's what they've heard about, through to a position where you say, look, you need to get your diabetes under control, and we need to do that, and then we're going to look at these different pairs of specs for the things that you're doing work-wise and hobby-wise and all the rest of it. To get them to that position is why you need to integrate everything from that whole point of why. Okay. And that comes from questioning the patient correctly. And I'm not talking about, do you want these progressive lenses where you can see far and see near? The patient will go, no. How much does that cost? No. But if you say, because you told me that you like to sit and watch TV and look at your phone at the same time, you're not going to be able to do that with a single pair of glasses. So because of that, I'm going to recommend that you have these. So careful questioning gives you this integrated approach, because you're going to question them about everything from their health through their ocular health through to their optical needs. And the optical needs are physiological. You know, you've got a really simple one is bifocals. And this is a thing that changed the practice's perspective. One of these ones where I had new guys wanting to really get a practice moving. You know, they were buying a certain level, and then within 3 months they were buying 4 or 5 times that level of product because of the way they changed things. But, you know, if you say to a bifocal wearer, I'm going to change you into progressive lenses, you know, they'll go, why?
Mm-hmm.
If you say to a bifocal wearer, how afraid are you of falling? And they go, oh, yeah, you know, how much do you think your bifocal contributes to your fear of falling? Oh, you know, when you're crossing curbs, when you're going downstairs. Oh, okay. So we should look at changing that for you, because we see these things as a risk for falls. And falls are the biggest killer of people over 70 out there, you know.
Yeah.
One of the biggest killers. And, you know, this is something I do with practitioners, because they still think, you know, bifocals are valid, which they are in certain circumstances. But
For sure.
when you take the aspect of someone's health and you say, okay, if this person is afraid of falling and they feel that their bifocals are contributing to that, you need to change them. You need to do something that's going to help them, because if you're over 75 and you fall and break your leg or your hip, 30% of people die within 3 months.
Yeah, that's bad.
So now you've got a whole different reason for the practitioners to start speaking about things, as opposed to just leaving it on the shelf or leaving it to the dispenser. You know, it becomes a moral obligation now, you know, once they know the stats and know all that sort of stuff. And, you know, I think we talked about this last time as well, the UV protection. In a country like Australia or New Zealand, where we've got the highest rates of skin cancer in the world, why the hell isn't everybody getting at least some sort of UV protection in their specs? Why aren't they getting transitions? Why aren't they getting a proper pair of prescription sunglasses, you know? Because they wear sunscreen all the time. You know, you see someone with a fairly pale complexion and blue eyes. So, well, you know, how often do you use sunscreen? Oh, I use it every day. Okay. Do you know you need that for your eyes as well? Oh, you know, you've got blue eyes. They're going to be more sensitive. You're more sensitive to light, aren't you? Oh, yeah, you know. So it's this whole, that's what I mean by integrated care. Every single aspect you've investigated, and you give the patient a diagnosis from the reason why they walked in, which is the first one you have to give, right through to all the other things that you find out through careful questioning. And then from there, it's a case of, let's look at what you want to do today, and let's look at things that we might do tomorrow or in the future, and just so that you're aware of where your vision's heading. So you've got a plan for that patient as well, and a plan over time. And hopefully that's going to be enough to get them coming back to your practice as well.
And how do you ensure that communication is, I guess, consistent amongst the whole team? Because you're probably going to have a situation where the optometrist may be a little bit more seasoned with this, but maybe the dispensing staff or the retail staff don't feel adept or don't feel, I mean, you know, like, how can you ensure that practice as a whole is, I guess, is in unison with this particular concept of integrated, you know, this integrated concept?
I think this is something that is going to be built into the communication structure of the practice all the way along. And again, now with computers and mobile phones, you've got really something ready-made for this. So number one, a pre-questionnaire before the patient even walks into the practice. So I'm pretty sure that this is integrated into a lot of practice management software these days. You can send something out. Knowing who's going to ask what questions that they're capable of receiving the answers to, and then they are recorded somewhere where everybody can access them. So whether that's in paper form, whether it's on a tablet, whether it's something that is going to be on each screen that the people are going to sit in front of as they go through the process, so that you know that the receptionist has asked about their health insurance and asked about what their budget might be today or something like that before they even get to the optometrist. And then you also know that when someone's done the pre-testing that, oh yes, their auntie has primary open-angle glaucoma and their father has AMD. That can be done before they even get into the optometrist, so the optometrist can then ask about that more in depth. But at least they've got that box ticked and they know that that's coming, walking into the consulting room. And then the consulting room, you go from there, and the optometrist has been able to, with, again, questioning, you can eliminate things that you don't need to talk about as well. And you can go to the dispenser and say, well, we've discussed this, this, and this. These things we're not caring about today, but we're going to talk about those. We're going to list those out for next time. And then I want you, together with the patient, you have a discussion. I want you to now walk them through their options, because the three things they want. First one is they want to be heard. They want to know that you've got the message from them. Number two, they want a recommendation. Number three is they want choice. And I'm not talking about, do you want plastic lenses or photochromic? These are the things we can do for you. Which of out of these things that we've talked about today, which ones do you want to do today? And we can do that at this level, we can do that at this level. So which are the most important? Let's tick those off, and we'll do those now. So choice is a different concept to what people would normally think about.
And I guess that it does allow you to structure communication in a specific and personalized way to know what they need to hear or not need to hear necessarily. And I think that with a bit of training, obviously, can be quite powerful for a practice.
And remember too, things like there are standardized questionnaires out there for dry eye. There are standardized questionnaires from people like Kate Gifford for myopia for kids and young adults. So you've got these things which you can then integrate. If this red flag comes up, then we give them this as well. So we start to build this whole image of the patient, and you see this in the doctor's rooms when you go to an ophthalmologist. They build up all the information before they walk into the ophthalmologist, and then they have that ready before they go on to the next stage. And that's that flow goes from reception to here to there. And optometry is the same. Optometry is just as capable, just as knowledgeable in being able to do what we do, and it is making sure before they walk in the door and after they've left the practice that you've got communication channels with them and that you're delivering on this whole concept of integrated care.
And I mean, if we look at that process as being a well-oiled machine, I think that's a phrase that I've stolen from you in this concept. What, in your view, are the key elements to ensure that, that this is kept as a well-oiled machine once you sort of get going into this particular flow?
All right. Okay. So number one, it is deciding the who and the where and all that sort of stuff, and making sure each person is trained and is resilient, and that your systems are resilient as well, because you can't have someone who is just on one thing so that when they're away, the whole thing falls apart. So you've got to build a resilient system. That's the first thing. And then the second part to it is training people and training new people and making sure that they understand, and maybe they buddy up and mentor with someone in the practice as they go along, and review. all this stuff is constantly up for review. If you've got new things happening after you've been to a conference, well, then you need to relook at your questionnaires. You need to relook at what you're going to ask about. If, I didn't do ortho K when I was in practice, but I did keratoconus, and now the way keratoconus lenses are fitted is completely different to the stuff that I had to do. So, there's a group of us who'd learnt a method called Clulow's method for back surface toric lenses, which I learned from a good friend of mine, Kevin Rooney, which is great for him to teach me because that helped me with these keratoconus patients. But of course, then now they've got all these other, as things come up, you have to then integrate new questions so that you move to the next level each time. And so constant review, training, having a resilient system, and again, people understanding why they're doing it. That's really important. We've just talked about that. And I think that's probably about it. Yeah.
You mentioned training and education, and I guess that I've got a whole heap of things that I want to discuss with training. But if I summarize it, what is it about training, or training often gets neglected? It's sort of one of those things that's generally put aside. Not every. I mean, there are some practices that are good at it, but when you see it as an obstacle or as a challenge for an independent practice, what tips would you have to ensure that there is training involved in a systematic way? Whether it's, with regards to new technology, new products, talk about mentoring as a part of that. What steps, if we look at training overall, can we help or advise, the listeners of that can assist them in this particular path to ensure that they're doing it well in some capacity or just in any capacity, I guess?
That's again a really good question, and something that's really so important to modern practice. So you've got a situation where you're talking about productivity. If someone isn't trained, how can they be productive? And particularly, even if they've come from another practice, they might not be trained in the way you're going to do things.
Mm.
So that question of productivity is going to revolve around your ability, the practice's ability to integrate that person as quickly as possible and to have them being productive as soon as possible. Because, I was always astounded when I asked this question about training, and I'd say, have you trained this person yet? Oh, no, I haven't got time.
Mm.
And it's the biggest reason that people give for a lot of things about not changing the way they approach things. It's always time. And yet there's always time for something else. Yeah. But if time is not the reason, it's an excuse, right? So if you're not prepared to give time to that person so that they're going to better treat your patients or better look after your patients, then maybe you need to rethink your objectives around what you're doing, your priorities, exactly. So training is something which is essential. The productivity side is clear, and particularly when you've got technology involved. So we had almost lost a client at one stage in a practice, a practice as a client rather, because they'd had a new person come in operating the tower. And the principal had been away on leave, been away for 4 weeks. And in that time, the person had done their way of doing the tower. And so they had 4 weeks of failed lenses.
Oh, sugar.
Yeah, 4 weeks of customers. So, and what's the thing that practices fear the most is the patient walking back in saying, I can't see with these.
Yeah.
Right? So you get one of those a month, it's going to cost you a bob. You get 20 of those in a month and you are in a hole.
Well, yeah. Yep.
So yeah, the training and being able to make sure that that space can be filled. If you haven't got the knowledge,
yes, there's
TAFE, there's the ACOD, there's places where you can send people to get optical training. There's actually a vision science course. If you want people to be at that level, you can take someone, they haven't necessarily gone on to be an optometrist, but you've got a vision scientist coming into your practice. So change the level of who you're going to hire. look at what are the requirements of someone walking into your practice. So a vision scientist, you might be able to give a whole lot more work to than someone who you want to be a dispenser, and dispensing in itself. People say, oh, all this new stuff is taking away my job. No, it's not. It's actually ramping up your job. You've got a whole lot more stuff to do with modern dispensing today than you ever had before. So don't tell me that you need to do this because otherwise it's taking your job away. It's not. Your job is amplified and you need to have the skills to be able to do it as well. And I think there's also room for the whole practice to train on things as well. Communication skills, we've talked about that. If you're going to ask questions, you need to know how to ask them. Asking an open-ended question so someone has a discussion with you. Being able to find different words so someone can understand what you're talking about. Making sure that Granny understands what you're talking about.
I think that's a really good point, because so often when we think of training, and we've also got suppliers that assist in training, and they're generally pretty specced up with regards to courses and and guidance that they can provide and utilizing them. But when we think about training, we invariably think about product and product association with regards to the technicality of the product and being trained in that. But there is a whole human side of it and a communication side of it that we probably neglect. And so I feel like there's a lot of room for improvement there. But let's just say, hypothetically speaking, a store is interested in that. How would they best find, a solution to that? Is it something that's got to outsource themselves? Are you aware of any particular, programs or any particular, I guess, references? And that's just, I know it's putting on the spot there. But
in terms of communication skills and so on, and even management, there's the Australian Institute of Management does heaps of courses. Okay. You've got TAFE level courses. You've got, what do they call them?
RTOs.
Yeah, registered training organisations. There's another thing that's integrated with TAFE as well, little night school short courses, those sort of things as well. So it's just a case of looking for it, and again, it's a tax deduction for the practice, but it's a revenue generator as well. So making sure that you can train your staff and they use that training, they use those skills every day. Sending people on conferences, there's always stuff being done on those. And talk to your supplier. Suppliers are always happy to do stuff. I mean, the biggest question that I'd get asked would be, that's great product, but how am I going to sell it to my patient? How am I going to talk to my patient about it? So we used to, years ago, we started writing these things down where we'd have a one line, what are the benefits? What are the things you can say to the patient about it? We did this innumerable times, product after product. This is for the optometrist to ask. These are the answers that you might get. These are for the dispenser to ask. These are the answers you might get. And, it's really something that's a constant effort to do, but it's something that returns, 5 times what you invest, at least.
The importance of it obviously can't be understated, and I think we've done a good job at addressing that pretty extensively. I want to change tunes slightly, and I want to speak about the future of the industry and how you see that. Again, it can be a more generalistic thought in terms of where you're thinking things are going to be, but I guess in some ways, if we can incorporate what your thoughts are on, where the biggest opportunities might exist, for independence over the next decade, whether it be niching, whether it be patient experience, different business models. I guess what's your summation of it all?
Oh, that's such a big question these days. When you think that there's been so many times when people have predicted the demise of independent optometry. So I've heard that every year for 45 years before I retired. Every year, optometry's going to die. It's the death of us. Specsavers are going to kill us. I shouldn't. Sorry, Specsavers. I'm not singling you out.
No, it's just a comment.
But it is this thing. It's always the glass half empty sort of attitude to optometry. But you look at where we are now. You have therapeutics and all sorts of health assessments, ocular assessments. You've got more lenses today, like, the 19 pages of iTalk, 490 pages of iTalk, more products, more frames, more fashion. My partner was in fashion. She was a fashion designer who had stuff at Melbourne Fashion Week and all sorts of things. And she'd talk about integrating fashion into optometry as well. So there's so many different avenues that practices could go down that leave them open to asking that one very clear question: what am I positioning myself on? So I think the one that is coming up is wearables. So you've got Meta, you've got Google, you've got Apple, you've got Amazon, all of them. And this was something that I spoke about probably 5, 6, 7 years ago. I said, why is Facebook buying shares in health companies? Right? Why is Amazon buying shares in health companies? This was something that was predictable, that was coming, and the change in computing is going to drive us even further down that path. Because once we start getting into these tiny computers, what are they called?
Nano sounds right to me. I'm not familiar with the terminologies with that sort of stuff.
But these new possibilities for having much more information fed by these tiny things within, which gives it much more power. As that computing power increases, so are the things that we can do in specs is going to increase so much more with wearables that are going to be integrated. So you've got, that's a future which is only this far away. You've got all this stuff that's current with the coatings, with the lenses themselves, with the personalization. And then what are the other things that are going to keep me interested as a practitioner? Because I think this is one of the biggest challenges if you're going to look at the future. I need to stay interested, because if I'm there going 1 or 2 all day, right, if that's your life, it becomes fairly dull fairly quickly. But because you've got all these other things, which path is going to be something that keeps my interest, which I can generate revenue with, so I'm not doing it for nothing so that my business fails because I don't have enough revenue? And how am I going to look to the next thing and keep my practice growing? Because you need the new patients and you need the old patients. Otherwise, your practice is going backwards. If your old patients are dying out, you're not replacing them with enough new patients. And then what's my strategy to renew with a new face if I'm going to retire? So, you've got this long-term strategy, but overall the industry itself, wearables, personalization, and then all the other things to keep a practitioner interested and having that big why in the morning of why I'm getting up to go to work.
And I guess as we start to wrap up all of this and looking, I guess, back, what for you was the most single important lesson that you'd want every independent practice owner or manager to remember? I guess if you reflect all your time in optics.
Make it interesting and be easy on yourself. Make it easier. Now, I spoke with a lawyer who'd been a big corporate lawyer, and he got into merchant banking and a few other things. I said, why did you do that? He said, because as a lawyer, as a corporate lawyer, I had to work harder all the time. And so as a practitioner, if you're not doing things to grow your business, you're having to work harder all the time because you're having to see more and more patients to pay your bills.
Yeah.
So work smarter, not harder, and make it easier on yourself. Because if you can have that time to look at the business from the outside, to have that integrated family life and do things that you enjoy, you're going to be a happier person, and you're going to like your turning up at work. You're going to like your patients more. I used to see these old guys around the place who were grumpy as hell with patients. And I thought, why is that? And then, I realized that if you don't keep your interest up, as a practitioner myself, you could end up being that grumpy old guy.
Yeah.
So be interested, make it easy for yourself, and have a life outside of your practice that makes you want to get up in the morning and say, yeah, I'm going to go in and be the best person I can in business today.
And, you've mentioned that, you recently retired and 45 years in the industry. I guess, one thing that's sort of come across in this chat to me is the importance of why. And I feel a lot of that comes back to a lot of things that we've discussed and knowing what that is. But as you look in reflection on your career, Tim, do you mind letting us know what was your why?
My why was I thought I could make a difference to the industry itself. So when I was an optometrist and I got into the politics with the South Australian government, and then, there was a guy who was a partner in the business I was in. He'd done his MBA. And so I went off and sat down and did my GMAT, which you had to do in those days. And then I got a call from the Optometrist Association and said, there's someone looking for someone for a job and we've put your name forward. I went, oh, okay. But my motivation was that I loved the industry and I thought I could do more by being on the commercial side than being a practitioner. And I hope that I've done that to a certain extent. I hope I've been able to impart some knowledge and some enthusiasm to people over the years. And I hope most of all that I've helped people help their patients, because, in the end, if your patients aren't happy, the practitioners are not going to be happy. And, your business is going to be, and as a supplier, this as well as a supplier, if you've got unhappy clients, it's a tough life out there. So, they'll line you up against the wall and shoot you. You told me this lens was going to work,
That's really good. And I mean, from, I'm relatively newish to the industry. I've only been in it about 10 years or so, but I guess, around the traps, I always hear positive things about you. So I think whatever you did, you did really well. And the feedback that I often hear is really positive, and you're being quite influential. So congratulations on your career, first and foremost. Thank you for your time today. Thanks for all your insights. I really appreciated our chat, and this and the one we had previously. And a lot of wisdom there and a lot of advice. So I think, I guess they're very fortunate to have had you on, and as am I. So thanks very much, Tim, and all the best for the future.
Absolute pleasure, Michael. Thank you so much. It's been great. Really, really good. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to The Focused View. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a 5-star review, subscribe on your preferred podcast app, and share it with your colleagues. It helps us reach more eye care professionals across Australia. For additional resources and downloads, visit thefocusedview.com.au. I'm Michael Nasser. Until next time, keep focused.